All right, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank Candace and Jennifer for the generous invitation to be here. What I'm going to be talking about today is based upon some of my research on school segregation, housing policy, and real estate activities, not just in Kansas City, but around the United States. I'm going to focus on two themes of the conference today: the theme of racial integration and equity, and what would it take to build thriving urban communities, suburban communities, and so on. And so I want to kind of focus my discussion today about if we're trying to strive towards racial integration and equity in our institutions, we have to understand why we have racial segregation and lack of equity or inequality within our institutions. And so today, my presentation is going to be about identifying some of the key events and actions underlying the post-1954 development of residential segregation in Kansas City, Missouri, and metropolitan Kansas City more generally, identify some key turning points and missed opportunities in the multi-decade struggle to desegregate schools and neighborhoods, and reveal how a historical trajectory set in motion many decades ago still molds contemporary responses, policy responses, and policy debates to the problems of racial segregation in schools and housing. Okay, so I have a series of goals I want to accomplish today. First is I want to address the interlocking nature of real estate activities, housing policy, and school decisions in the development of segregation, not just in Kansas City, but elsewhere. And I also want to describe and explain how Troost Avenue became a major racial dividing line in Kansas City in the decades after 1950. And my third goal is to describe why patterns of segregation in Kansas City remains strikingly high despite the passage of fair housing ordinances and other anti-discrimination statutes over the last several decades. All right, so there's a good news, bad news aspect of this. The good news is on the various indices of segregation, Kansas City has been declining, especially over the last 20 years or so. So that's the good news, that segregation is declining on the various measures. However, that is happening in all cities in the United States. So Kansas City is not unique in its decline of segregation. And also the bad news is, despite declines in segregation, when we look at different measures, Kansas City still ranks very high when it comes to segregation. And finally, towards the end of my presentation, I'm going to be focusing on some policies and practices that may help remedy the vestiges of segregation created by past discriminatory real estate activities and housing policies. And basically kind of lay out in my last couple slides or so some points of discussion, some points of debate that we might address dealing with what can we do as practitioners, as academics, as researchers, as policymakers, perhaps elected officials. What can we do to help undo patterns of segregation and create more equitable institutions? Let me spend a little bit of time talking about the harms of residential segregation. I teach courses at Tulane University in New Orleans dealing with topics involving segregation, gentrification, racial inequality, in my urban sociology, in my urban policy and planning courses. And as an urban sociologist, trained as a sociologist, I view my role as an instructor and as a teacher and mentor to lay out for the students the contemporary research as well as past research that explains why segregation is a negative feature in U.S. society. And so we know from much research conducted by social scientists as well as others that segregation stifles economic growth in our metropolitan areas. We know this from looking at different metropolitan areas, not just Kansas City, but we see that there's neighborhoods that have been disinvested, that have been abandoned, whereas other areas, especially on the fringes of our metropolitan area, experience phenomenal growth, economic development, and affluence. So this segregation is both a reflection and reinforcer of these patterns of uneven economic development in our metropolitan areas. Okay, segregation restricts opportunities for upward mobility. Okay, so we know that where you grow up is just as important or can be just as important as how you grow up. Okay, so where you grow up in a particular metropolitan area has a big impact on your opportunities for upward mobility. Okay, so we know growing up in an affluent area plugs you into networks of upward mobility to the extent that children have access to high quality education, good schools, low crime neighborhoods, access to jobs in other points of affluence. Segregation geographically concentrates the social problems. Unemployment, violent crime, and poverty are predominantly concentrated in central cities, and that's been the case for many decades. Another aspect we might focus on in the harms of segregation is that it reinforces and reflects fiscal inequalities between or among cities in a metropolitan area. All right, so we can look at the different cities in any metropolitan area. It can be Kansas City, it can be New Orleans, it can be any major metropolitan area. And we know that there are striking fiscal inequalities between not just school districts, but city governments themselves. And those fiscal inequalities manifest themselves because of the tax base of the community, or so the more affluent the tax base of a community, the more affluent the activities, the policies, and the programs that the city government can implement. As much sociological research has revealed over the last 10 years or so, that segregation was a major driver of the subprime mortgage crisis that eventually metastasized into a global economic recession. Where did subprime mortgage lending start? Started predominantly in Hispanic neighborhoods, poor Hispanic neighborhoods, and then basically had contagion effects from there, spreading out, infecting different housing markets around in our metropolitan areas, and eventually plunging the U.S. economy into a very intense recession. I think one of the more important aspects here, we can talk about the facts and the data and research surrounding the harms of segregation, but to the extent that we recognize segregation as a manifestation of spatial inequality that interconnects with class and race, then we basically have to acknowledge that segregation calls into question our basic demographic ideals in the United States. It is equality of opportunity. And this has been the case for many, many decades. This isn't particularly new now. Okay, so when there's segregation, sometimes when I teach courses and students will ask, well, why should we care about residential segregation? Racial segregation and when it comes to neighborhoods, housing, schools, and so on, why should we care about that? And we should care about it because it basically challenges our system of government, our democratic system. To the extent that we educate our children to believe in equality of opportunity, then segregation contradicts that. And so that's an important point I want to bring up here. Okay, so in short, residential segregation is a harm to all of us, not just those living in disadvantaged neighborhoods, but those of us, all of us here. Okay, so segregation is a societal harm, a condition that harms us all, not just those residing in poverty-impacted neighborhoods. All right, so that's the kind of preface I want to have going into my discussion today, the harms of segregation. Not just segregation harming particular people. There might be particular people that benefit from segregation, but ultimately those who believe that they benefit from segregation, I think, are wrong. All right, so residential segregation in Troost Avenue. Let me talk a little bit about this for a moment. So as I mentioned earlier, there have been noticeable declines in residential segregation in Kansas City on the different measures of segregation. And I can talk about those measures of segregation in the question and answer period if some of you are interested in those, how we measure segregation. Troost Avenue in Kansas City has been a long-standing class and racial dividing line. That's not new, has been going back for many decades. Nice quote here from former Mayor Emanuel Cleaver from back in 1992, recognized back then Troost Avenue as a major class and racial dividing line. But I also think that we might ask ourselves, okay, that was decades ago, that Troost Avenue became a formative racial dividing line. However, what's interesting is that when we look at census data from 2010, and we're not looking at estimates, we're looking at the exact count of people in 2010. There are no census tracts west of Troost Avenue that are over 50% black. Okay, so every census tract in 2010, west of Troost Avenue is majority white. All right, so to be fair here, when we drill down to the census block group or block level, there are block groups and census blocks that do contain majority African American blocks and block group. So that's true, okay, but at the census tract level, Troost Avenue still remains a dividing line. Okay, but I don't really want to focus much attention on that. I'll focus attention on the how and why questions surrounding Troost Avenue. But I really want to focus on Troost Avenue as a symbol or metaphor of racial and class inequality. All right, so I want to go forward here in the time that I have to talk about not only how this street became a major racial dividing line, but why it became a major racial dividing line. And I want to kind of look at this, and I'm going to give you a little story here. When I was doing my dissertation research on the origin and development and consequences of racial segregation in Kansas City back in the mid to late 1990s when I was a graduate student at the University of Kansas in the sociology department, I was perplexed and confused about when I look at census data in Kansas City. And I could see the census data over in 1940, 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90, and I could see the striking racial transformation of those neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue in the period after 1950s. And I thought, okay, I can identify some factors, but I don't understand why Troost Avenue became such a rigid racial dividing line after the 1950s. Okay, so I started writing some papers about this, looking at real estate activities, looking at urban renewal and highway displacement activities, which I'll focus on. And I developed a paper and I sent it to a number of scholars and researchers around the country asking for feedback. And I also sent it to Arthur Benson, who was the lead attorney for the Kansas City, Missouri schools desegregation case in the 1970s and 80s. And he sent me back feedback. And he said, well, you know, you're focusing on real estate activities and highway displacement, urban renewal activities, but you're missing a crucial explanation. What about schools? What about school administrative decisions? Okay, if school administrative decisions were not important, the Troost wall would have been a wave rather than a strict wall going down Troost Avenue. And I thought to myself, well, I hadn't really looked at schools, and so he referred me to a number of different collections to access as well as people to interview. Okay, so the key thing here is while Troost Avenue does not necessarily today is not an explicit and overt racial boundary line, the vestiges of Troost Avenue as a racial boundary still remain today. Okay, so I want to talk about three things here. Okay, historical development of segregation in Kansas City. Okay, so segregation has an origin, it has a historical development to it, and it has major negative consequences. And I talked about those consequences or harms earlier. All right, so I'm going to really focus on the period after the Second World War, and in particular the period after 1954. And that's not to say that there wasn't striking inequalities when it came to race and class in our institutions and neighborhoods. But that period after especially after the Second World War, is a crucial period because there's two factors that are important. They're actually kind of paradoxical, but are about segregation. The first is we see the intensification of segregation in the decades after 1954. At the same time, we're seeing the passage of legislation and new policies that declare racial discrimination in housing and schools as unenforceable or illegal. Okay, so in 1949, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that racially restrictive covenants cannot be enforceable through real estate activities. We see the passage we see the Supreme Court decision, the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court, the decision that outlawed the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896 of separate but equal in schools and other institutions. We also see a variety of legislation passed in the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act, and most importantly, the Fair Housing Act that declared that racial discrimination cannot be enforced within housing markets. Okay, so we see the emergence of policies that are declaring that overt and legally sanctioned discrimination and segregation is outlawed. At the same time, we're seeing a reinforcement and perpetuation of patterns of residential segregation. All right, and so a lot of my research focuses on why is segregation increasing in the decades after 1954, when in fact racial discrimination in institutions, overt and legally sanctioned racial discrimination, is supposedly being outlawed. All right, so that's the another kind of contextual issue I'm going to focus on here. And so, as we look at Kansas City going forward in the 1950s, I want to focus on three aspects here: urban renewal and highway displacement activities, school administrative decisions, and real estate blockbusting. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about each of those. All right, so urban renewal and highway displacement activities. So, in the period after the Second World War, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, this was a period of tremendous upheaval in the Kansas City housing market. Okay, it was a period of a very dramatic reorganization of land uses, as well as a great deal of displacement caused by urban renewal and highway displacement activities. So from 1953 to 1969, the LCRA, which stands for Land Clearance for Redevelopment Authority, cleared residents from 13 major urban renewal projects. Most of these surrounded the downtown area. Okay, and so this particular activity, clearing residents was part of the 1949 Housing Act that created the Urban Renewal Program that was in place in cities in the United States from 1949 to 1974. In 1974, the Urban Renewal Program was redefined as the Community Development Block Grant Program. Okay, so going forward after 1974, as cities wanted federal money to help revitalize urban areas, they would now be reliant upon the Community Development Block Grant Program. Okay, so the Urban Renewal Program from 1949 to 1974 was really about slum clearance, was designated areas within central cities that were defined as slums, acquiring the blighted property through eminent domain, and then clearing that property, and in the process, relocating residents to other areas of the city and metropolitan area in an effort to revitalize those areas within the central city. Okay, so the idea was to convert urban neighborhoods into industrial and commercial land use, and urban renewal programs had similar activities. It was to strengthen the tax base, revitalize the urban core, and shore up downtown property values. During the same time, the Missouri Department of Highways and Transportation removed residents for 4 major highways in the Central Business District Expressway Loop. Okay, so these 4 highways included, as we all know, and we travel on them all the time, I-70, I-29, I-35, and the South Midtown Freeway. The South Midtown Freeway was renamed the Bruce Watkins Drive in 1988. Okay, if anybody's interested in ever exploring the history of the Watkins Drive, I think it's an excellent dissertation topic. Occasionally people ask me about, what's some areas that if I had another opportunity to do more research on Kansas City, Bruce Watkins Drive. And so we see the Bruce Watkins Drive as kind of a beautiful boulevard. However, when it was first proposed in the 1950s and 60s, it was going to be an 8 to 10 lane expressway. And it was going to go from the downtown all the way out to Grandview and beyond, and created a great deal of controversy and bitter resistance and opposition. Bruce Watkins led the resistance, and there was a protracted litigation from the late 1960s, 1968, all the way into the 1980s, until the highway was redesigned as a scenic 4-lane boulevard. All right, so we think it's so you kind of picture what's going on here. You have urban renewal activities as well as highway displacement activities. You have thousands and thousands of people being displaced on a year-to-year basis. So there's a tremendous amount of people being funneled into the local housing market. Not surprisingly, the Missouri Department of Housing and Highways and Transportation, as well as the LCRA, engaged in segregationist relocation activities, with white residents being relocated to white neighborhoods and African-American residents being relocated to predominantly African-American neighborhoods. All right, so this is a crucial aspect in Kansas City history because both before and after, you did not see the widespread destruction of housing in a particular discrete period within the city. Second major aspect I want to focus on is segregated school attendance boundaries and administrative decisions here. Okay, so I want to focus specifically on the actions of officials of the Kansas City, Missouri School District who chose to segregate schools after 1954 by establishing racially identifiable school attendance boundaries along Troost Avenue. All right, so we know that prior to 1954, schools in Kansas City were segregated by law. This was by the state of Missouri going all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so in 1955, in response to the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court decision, the Kansas City, Missouri School District eliminated its explicitly and legally sanctioned racial attendance zones with neighborhood attendance zones. And I'm going to talk a lot about the significance of this second bullet point in a few moments. But just kind of giving a quick summary here. So over the next 2 decades, the Kansas City, Missouri School District made frequent shifts in the attendance of its schools. And segregated school actions from the 1950s to the 1970s basically established Troost Avenue and reinforced it through the 1970s as a major racial attendance line. All right, so keep in mind, what else is happening here? 50s to the 70s, we're seeing massive displacement going on for highway building and slum clearance programs at the same time that the school district is using Troost Avenue as a racial attendance line. All right, so I have 2 tables here I want to focus on that kind of reveal the racial transformation of schools east and west of Troost Avenue. Okay, and the first table here I want to focus on. All right, so this table shows elementary schools east of Troost Avenue, south of 31st Street, at 5-year intervals from 1955 to 1975. Okay, so in this column here, this is the name of the school. Okay, we can see the schools here. And we see the black population by percent in each of the schools in 1955, 1960, 65, 70, and 74, 75. All right, so when we look at this table, we can see, or the takeaway I want you to see here in this table, is the very striking and rapid change in some of these schools just in a 5-year period. Okay, so if you look at, say, the first one here, Linwood School. Okay, Linwood School goes from 18% black to almost 90% within just a 5-year period. Okay, so that's a big transition going on there. If we go down to Seven Oaks here, a boundary line is changing right here. The asterisk symbolizes a boundary, a change of boundary during that interval. Okay, so goes from Seven Oaks goes from 0 to 65, and then 10 years later, 96. We can see in other schools. Let's focus on Man here. Goes from 0, and then 5 years later, 84%. And so almost all elementary schools south of 31st Street, east of Troost Avenue, within a very short period in Kansas City history, experienced very dramatic and rapid racial transformation. Okay, so it's the rapidity. When I was first researching this, I was struck by why are these schools changing so fast? Okay, that I can understand. We know schools change ethnically and racially and based upon socioeconomic status. However, something is going on here to explain the rapid nature of this transformation. This isn't just natural and spontaneous demographic processes operating here. There has to be something going on that's important. And this kind of and the way I was approaching this connects back to the point I mentioned earlier. As an historical sociologist, when we look at cities, our cities don't change by spontaneity. They don't change by luck or happenstance or just normal demographic processes. Our cities change because of the decisions and actions of key actors and organized interests. And so this, going back to what I mentioned earlier, we have a tremendous displacement going on in the housing market because of urban renewal and highway displacement activities. However, those activities do not explain why these schools are changing so fast racially east of Troost Avenue. Okay, so you can see that almost all neighborhood schools or elementary schools experienced racial turnover after the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954. And so by the 1970s, by the early 1970s, 16 out of these 18 elementary schools is over 90% African American, and also every high school east of Troost Avenue is also over 90% African American. These high schools were Lincoln, Central, Paseo, and Southeast. Those were the four main high schools in east of Troost Avenue during this period. Okay, so big transition going on there. So let's look at west of Troost Avenue. Okay, so elementary school, this is an analogous table but showing the schools west of Troost Avenue during the same period. Okay, so we have, we can see that not much transition going on here until really that period after 1970. Yeah. All right, so again, the asterisk symbolizes a boundary change in the 5-year interval. Okay, and I list the source at the bottom of this table. I'll be happy to talk about sources in the question and answer period if any of you are interested in it. All right, so this particular table is important because it shows the kind of stasis of change in those schools west of Troost Avenue. Okay, so it's not, and also I want to emphasize here, though I don't have this in the table, the schools west of Troost Avenue, the schools east of Troost Avenue, in contrast to schools west of Troost Avenue, not only are experiencing a racial transformation, but they're also experiencing widespread disinvestment, decay, overcrowding. Okay? Whereas those schools west of Troost Avenue are underutilized. So that's a big, big issue. Okay? So it's not just the racial transformation that we're talking about. We're talking about decisions that are being made by the school district, not only to channel the expanding African American population east of Troost Avenue through segregated schools, but also to disinvest in those schools. And also to promote, and also those schools tended to be overcrowded, whereas the schools west of Troost Avenue tended to be underutilized. All right, so let me get into some details here about how, let me get into some details about how and why. Okay, so the previous two tables I displayed the what question. Okay, addresses this is what is happening. So let's talk about the how and why. All right, so I want to talk here about a crucial turning point and some missed opportunities in the effort to desegregate schools. And I want to focus on the summer of 1963 because there were 3 major actions or decisions that occurred during this summer that represent, I think, when you look back in history, and we can talk about hindsight and 2020, hindsight bias and so on. But when we trying to understand how and why questions, as a sociologist, I'm interested in were there missed opportunities, were there chances to change what was happening, were people aware of other decisions and other actions that they could have taken to either desegregate schools or create, going to the theme of the conference here, more equity within our schools, to promote racial equality within schools rather than to reinforce and to perpetuate racial inequality in schools. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about 1963 here. And so So we're talking about about 6-7 years after the school district begins implementing or responding to the Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Okay, and so in June 20th, 1963, a group of black and white residents staged a protest at a Kansas City, Missouri school district board meeting, charging that the district, via its attendance zone policies, was reinforcing neighborhood segregation by adopting, according to protesters, and I'll quote here, the unwritten law of the Troost line as the boundary separating white and black populations in Kansas City. And this protest was reported in the minutes of the meeting of the school district in June '63. So over the next several weeks, there were other protests that occurred within school board meetings surrounding the use of Troost, the allegations that the school board was using Troost Avenue as a school attendance boundary line. So the racial intent and I think effect of the Troost Avenue attendance boundary decision was not lost on local residents. People were aware of this happening, and they were protesting against it. Okay, the second point I want to focus on here is that later that month, later in June of 1963, Kansas City, Missouri School District Superintendent James Hazlitt released a statement that the board, quote, accepts the principle of promoting integration as one of many factors to be considered, but it does not believe that priority should be given to this above all other factors, end quote. All right, I think that's a very revealing statement. Right? It basically says that racial integration will not be given priority. And they were going forward. There are other things that the school district needs to be aware of and needs to take account of. And racial integration is not a priority of the school district. Third, on August 1st, 1963, the board adopted a policy statement declaring, quote, that integration is a factor to be taken into account within the school system whenever it is possible to do so without destroying the fundamental principle of the school as a major service unit to the neighborhood of which it is part, end quote. All right, so that's a policy that the school district is adopting going forward. Another, I think, very revealing statement here, okay, in the sense that it associates integration with destroying neighborhood schools. Okay? All right, so it's communicating to people in the school district that integration is not something, not only is not going to be a priority, but is not going to be something that we're going to take into account because it could be a factor that could destroy the neighborhood school as a major focal point of the community. All right, so the takeaway here, these three major events and actions here were a crucial turning point where the decisions of the school district lock it in a trajectory of reinforcing and perpetuating racially segregated schools going forward and continuing over the next 2 decades. Okay, so basically another takeaway here is that neighborhood schools become a code word for maintaining segregated schools. Even to this day, we know that when debates occur within local school districts about maintaining the integrity and autonomy and identity in neighborhood schools, we should be skeptical of those kinds of claims. They sound persuasive, but neighborhood schools have historically referred to segregated schools. I could talk more about that later on. Okay, so during this time and going forward into the 1960s and 70s, the school board repeatedly justified its segregationist attendance boundary decisions on the grounds that neighborhood unity, neighborhood identity, neighborhood autonomy had to be preserved before racial integration and desegregation could go forward. And so these claims form the basis and the justification for changes in school district attendance boundaries that were changed and redrawn dozens of times from the 1950s to the 1970s to segregate African Americans in schools east of Troost Avenue while maintaining the predominantly white character of schools west of Troost Avenue. Okay, so let's talk about some missed opportunities. Okay, so going forward into the 1960s, a lot of change happening, not just in Kansas City, but in U.S. society in general. In 1965, the Kansas City, Missouri school district officials rejected a proposal from school desegregation consultants to build racially mixed schools. Okay, in 1968, the Kansas City, Missouri school district rejected a proposal from Superintendent James Hazlitt to establish a system of racially mixed schools. Okay, so the issue of school segregation and desegregation is being debated within the school district. And there are policies and proposals being introduced. They're being debated. Okay, so there's no inevitability here, historical inevitability, to the transformation of the schools east of Troost Avenue. Okay, so there are actions that could have been taken during this period. Okay, in the 1960s, the Kansas City, Missouri School District implemented what was called an intact busing policy. All right, so busing was a major focal point of debate in school districts in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. It is, should busing be used to desegregate schools? Is it a viable policy option for remedying racial inequality within schools? Okay, so the intact busing policy with the school district was actually not a desegregation measure at all. And so what this busing policy did was bus African-American students from predominantly African-American neighborhoods and schools into predominantly white schools. However, those African-American students were segregated within those schools and not allowed to mix with the white students in those schools. Okay, so this intact busing policy actually was quite much so an insult. It was basically designed to perpetuate segregation. And it was a way for the school district to say, hey, we're desegregating schools. Look, we're busing African-American students to these white schools. However, what the school district was not telling people was those African-American students were not allowed to mix with the other white students at the schools, and they were purposely segregated at the schools that they attended. Okay, and so in 1969, legislation was introduced in the Missouri legislation to equalize school funding through a policy or legislation introduced by Representative James Spainhour. Okay, so this particular policy was not necessarily to explicitly reduce racial inequalities in schools, but equalize funding across schools, okay, and across school districts too. All right, so it's not so by the late 1960s into the 1970s, it's becoming very, very clear that urban school districts are hemorrhaging when it comes to resources. The tax base is leaving the cities. We see during this time, during the 60s and 70s, burgeoning suburban development. The tax base is leaving the central city, not just in Kansas City, but across the United States, and moving to the suburbs. Okay, so the Spainhour plan was basically kind of a redistribution of resources from wealthy school districts to poor school districts. Okay, not surprisingly, this plan was opposed by many. Okay, but it was also a plan that at the time, in conjunction with the other policies here, is what I would refer to as missed opportunities in the struggle to desegregate schools here. All right, so major period here for in the history of school segregation and desegregation in Kansas City. All right, so by the early 1970s, we see much protest. We see much, not only civil rights protests, but protests against racial inequalities within schools. Until 1976, school attendance boundaries did not cross Troost Avenue, despite overcrowding in schools east of Troost Avenue and underutilization of schools west of Troost Avenue. And the decision to eliminate Troost Avenue by the school district came because of a lawsuit initiated by the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1973. And really, there was no comprehensive desegregation measure proposed until 1977, when the lawsuit of Jenkins versus Missouri, which became Kansas City's landmark desegregation case, was initiated. All right, the third major factor I want to mention here. All right, so we have the two, I've talked about the two other factors. Urban renewal and highway displacement activities, and second, segregative school attendance or administrative decisions. Okay, so we can see those actions going on. School attendance boundary decisions don't necessarily explain the rapid transformation going on in those schools east of Troost Avenue. We can understand that they might help perpetuate and reinforce segregation, but there's another factor that also explains the rapid transformation, and that's real estate blockbusting. Okay, so blockbusting is a real estate activity or practice in which a real estate agent attempts to move an African-American homeowner or African-American family or minority family, Hispanic family, into an all-white neighborhood for purposes of exploiting latent white racial fears and stereotypes of impending racial turnover in the neighborhood and fears of property devaluation. So blockbusting is a very exploitive and victimizing transaction in which a real estate agent attempts to activate fears of racial minority groups in order to stimulate the racial transformation of the neighborhood, buy up the property in the neighborhood at depressed prices, and then resell to a needy homeowner at a very inflated price, and in the process generating a huge profit for the real estate agent. Okay, again, so it's a very victimizing and exploitive transaction. All right, so what are some techniques here? And one technique is to send cards to homeowners in the neighborhood, urging them to sell before the neighborhood turns racially. Flooding a neighborhood with for sale signs, showing African-American families many homes in the same all-white neighborhood. All right, so blockbusting was a practice that really was set in motion through real estate activity, through school boundary decisions after 1954. All right, blockbusting is a real estate activity that goes on today and as well as it went on before 1954. However, the period after 1954 is really important because of the school attendance boundary decisions I'm mentioning, but also blockbusting is very difficult to implement on a widespread scale in the absence of burgeoning suburban housing. And so in the period after, in the 1950s and later, into the 60s, into the 70s, we have the opening up of major suburban housing markets in Kansas City, Johnson County, the north of the river, Grandview, Raytown, and so on. All right, so let me talk a little bit about some of the response to blockbusting during these years. Okay, so blockbusting was widely reported in local newspapers, the Kansas City Star, Kansas City Times, and the Kansas City Star, or the Kansas City Call. And you see in the mobilization of many urban neighborhoods near here. The 4963 Neighborhood Coalition, which was formed in 1971, the Blue Hills Neighbors, the Marlboro Heights Neighborhood Coalition. You see it in the passage of an ordinance by the Kansas City, Missouri City Council outlawing blockbusting in 1964. You also see it in the passage of a fair housing ordinance in 1967. This is actually kind of important because I think it's illustrative in some ways of how Kansas City was a pioneer when it came to fair housing. Okay, so the National Fair Housing Act comes a year later in 1968, shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King in April of 1968. But Kansas City was implementing a fair housing ordinance before that, okay? And the fair housing ordinance was a major reaction to the blockbusting activities of real estate agents that were working in the neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue during this period, basically working to activate fears of impending racial turnover to stimulate racial transformation of the neighborhood. You also see it in the official condemnation from local government officials. So I want to read a quote here. From Mayor Charles Wheeler in 1971. And so he makes a report to the Kansas City, Missouri City Council in May of 1971, recognizing the widespread real estate blockbusting that was affecting neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue. As he put it, the brokerage practices of selling to blacks only in areas contiguous to already black neighborhoods have caused a mounting flood of blockbusting, which threatens to overwhelm the entire south and southeast sides of Kansas City, Grandview, Raytown, and perpetuating a completely segregated housing market. This process has destroyed the property values of tens of thousands of white families, many of whom would want to stay if the neighborhoods were truly integrated, and thus increased the cost of housing to black families because of speculation, lack of an established mortgage market, and higher insurance rates. Okay, so the mayor of the city was well aware of real estate blockbusting at the time and was making the case before the city council that something needed to be done about it. Okay, you also see it, I mentioned earlier in the second bullet point, neighborhood coalitions were well aware of blockbusting real estate activities, and actually many of them mobilized to try to stop it. Okay, I want to read a quote here from the newsletter of the 4963 Neighborhood Coalition from January of 1996. And this newsletter was celebrating their 25th anniversary as a neighborhood. And the title of this newsletter is Troost, Borderline or Backbone. Okay, so it's referring to Troost Avenue as a borderline, or is Troost Avenue a backbone for the neighborhood? Okay, so the 4963 Neighborhood Coalition was established specifically with neighborhood boundaries at 49th Street and 63rd Street, but purposely crossing Troost Avenue. Okay, and it was a conscious decision to do that. Okay, in order to maintain the racially mixed and integrated character of the neighborhood. All right, so let me read this quote. I really like this quote. All right, so again, this is from 1996. They're celebrating their 25th anniversary as a neighborhood. 25 years ago, our neighborhood coalition came into being to hold out against the ignorance of racism. Unscrupulous realtors were trying to scare residents with racial fear in order to buy houses cheaply and to make big profits. Phone calls were often made to white homeowners and told that their property values were dropping and they had better move quick and get as much money as they could before they move in. A group of residents, black and white, got together and held meetings throughout the neighborhood. The message was simple: sell your house when you want to whom you want to, but don't let yourself be frightened into the suburbs. Welcome new families into the neighborhood, no matter what their race, and let's live like neighbors should. Okay, so neighborhood coalitions during this period, in the 60s and 70s, knew what was happening, okay, but they didn't really understand the how and why of what was happening. During this time, you can read school board minutes of meetings as well as reports, and the school board blames the racial transformation of schools east of Troost Avenue on blockbusting. Blockbusting becomes the scapegoat. Okay? But real estate blockbusting agents could refer to the school district school attendance boundary as a way of stimulating white flight from neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue. All right, so let me talk a little bit about some historical legacies here. All right, so, and this is some points here. So we have our three major factors that we've outlined here. Okay, so urban renewal and highway displacement activities set in motion a huge wave of intra-metropolitan movement of people during the 2 decades after the 1950s. Second, the adoption of neighborhood attendance zones by the officials of the Kansas City, Missouri School District was a means to circumvent the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court decision and maintain segregated schools. And not surprisingly, school districts across the United States were doing this. Okay, so the Supreme Court did not build any enforcement mechanism into the famous Brown decision, but basically left it up to school districts themselves to implement policies to desegregate schools. So not surprisingly, Kansas City is not unique here. Every school, just about every school district in the United States, especially school districts in the Midwest and Northeast, adopted neighborhood attendance zones as a way of circumventing the Supreme Court's decision and thereby maintain segregated schools. Okay, so Kansas City's experience, I think, is illustrative of what we might call the school housing nexus here. And the nexus can be stated in two ways. That the segregated decisions of the Kansas City, Missouri School District and the blockbusting activities of real estate agents had reinforcing effects. Okay, so the school district could blame the segregated nature of the schools on real estate blockbusting. At the same time, the real estate blockbusters could refer to the school district as a major selling ploy to push whites out of the neighborhoods east of Troost Avenue. All right, so this is a crucial point here because this, to me, is the explanation for the rapid transformation of those schools east of Troost Avenue after the period of 1954. Okay, so we see a dramatic transformation. It's very rapid. The magnitude is unprecedented. You did not see that rapid transformation before 1954, and you did not see it after in the 1970s. Okay, so that's this crucial period in the formation of urban neighborhoods was really about the decisions of the school district and real estate activities. Okay, so school policies had racial housing consequences, and real estate actions had racial school consequences, hence the interlocking nature of school attendance boundary decisions as well as real estate activities and housing policies. Okay, so I think also what's important in these points is that that white schools west of Troost Avenue tended to be underutilized, and schools east of Troost Avenue tended to be overcrowded and disinvested and substandard, tended to reinforce in the minds of white residents that African American schools are inferior and substandard. A prejudice and stereotype that formed the basis of decisions to basically leave the city and to venture out and move to burgeoning suburban housing markets. Okay, so these kinds of racial perceptions form the basis of individual and collective decisions that led to white resistance to school integration policies during the 60s and 70s, and one could say even into the 1980s and 90s, and it also formed the basis of white flight from Southeast neighborhoods from the 50s to the 1960s. All right, so all that happened a long time ago. Okay? So we're talking about something that occurred decades ago. However, I want to kind of, why we might think that that's something that happened a long time ago, decades ago, the racial geography of the city and metropolitan area has not really changed that much over time. And we can see, as I mentioned earlier, the good news that on indicators of segregation, that we see a lessening of segregation over time, racial segregation, which is good, which is fantastic. We want to see that. But at the same time, we also see continuing challenges. And some of our challenges that we have today operate in this historical context and historical legacy that was set a long time ago that both offer hope, but at the same time offer us problems and maybe even impediments to change. And so I want to just focus a little bit on these, and then I want to move to a discussion focusing on maybe what we can debate and discuss as remedies or solutions to the problems that we're seeing with respect to the harms of residential segregation. Okay, so racial segregation in public schools continues despite recurrent court rulings banning it. Okay, so when we look at schools around the United States, school segregation remains strikingly high. So while indicators and measures of residential segregation, racial residential segregation, housing segregation might be declining, school segregation is not declining that much. Okay, so there's a real disjuncture there when it comes to racial segregation in schools. Okay, so as many public opinion polls have showed, many sociologists have studied this, there continues to be deep resistance among many whites to pro-integration policies. And this is important because it's difficult to implement pro-integration policies to undo racial segregation in schools and housing and other institutions if people have deep resistance to it. We also see, especially in recent years, a resurgence of white supremacist groups and violent acts of racial hatred. This is something we have to contend with, and something that's part of the challenge that we face as policymakers, as scholars, activists, and advocates. Also, the uniquely U.S. system of funding schools, local property taxes, is a very rigid structural problem that on one hand is not a direct cause of racial segregation in school, but is an indirect factor that reinforces and perpetuates class segregation as well as race segregation among school districts. Okay, so local property taxes. The more affluent the property tax base, the more affluent the schools will be, because the base the tax base is the foundation by which governments can extract resources to fund public activities, parks, recreation, roads, infrastructure, schools. Okay, so the poorer the tax base, the poorer the school district. It also is ironic there, in many cities that have a poor or non-affluent tax base, the tax rate tends to be higher because the school district and the city itself has to extract more resources to fund the school district. Not surprisingly, the higher the tax rate, the more difficult it is to attract new businesses to the area, because businesses are going to migrate to where taxes are lower. Okay, so I don't have a solution to this. I come with questions, not with solutions. And so this particular question of what can we do about undoing patterns of segregation in the context of this uniquely U.S. system of funding schools is going to be a real challenge. All right, so dismantling the Troost wall. All right, so building integrated communities. Returning back to the main theme of the conference here. What can we do to build thriving urban, suburban communities and to achieve racial integration, equity, as well as excellent education for all of our students? All right, so when I'm talking about the dismantling of the Troost wall here, I'm not talking about Troost Avenue per se. I'm talking about the metaphor, the symbol that Troost Avenue has in the minds of people as a symbol of racial inequality en masse. Okay, so the metaphor of the wall, okay, that as we know, it's not an explicit racial boundary anymore. However, it's a symbol of racial inequality, and therefore attacking those causes of racial inequality is a major, I think, a major goal that we want to have. All right, so, and I'm going to mention 6 things here. Okay, the first thing is I think we need to identify policy actions to undo residential segregation. All right, it kind of sounds intuitive. Well, of course, and that we're here for. That's what we're focusing on. But I want to kind of put this in a little bit a contextual question. There's a lot of discussion. I see this in Brookings Institution reports. I see it in reports from various fair housing organizations. I see it in lots of different reports and studies, white papers, and so on that talk about the harms of segregation. Okay, I mentioned those earlier. What's important, I think, is it's not enough just to talk about the harms of segregation. We should be talking about the harms of segregation. At the same time, we're talking about the causes of segregation, those historical causes, which I mentioned earlier, the 3 that we have in Kansas City, with an eye towards identifying those policy actions that can undo segregation. So there's a very clear advocacy dimension here. We're not just gathering data, and we're not just doing research to explain the what, how, and why. We want to engage in research, and we want to engage in data collection to identify to address what, how, and why questions, but also identify how to undo and solve those problems that we've addressed with the what, how, and why questions. All right, so we want to identify, and I'm going to focus on several of them here. Some of them I think are very doable. Others are kind of more questions to address. All right, so there's a long-standing policy debate in sociology and political science and the education field about, can racially neutral policies and programs be effective anti-segregationist tools? Okay, so can we implement racially neutral policies to undo racial segregation or to attack racial segregation? I mean, it has very intuitive public policy appeal. A lot of elected officials, both locally, nationally, as well as on the state level, like these kinds of policies. If we don't direct resources to particular racial groups and direct them to all groups, can we use these particular kinds of policies to attack and dismantle the foundations of racial segregation? And analogous to this kind of claim or question is, can we undo racial residential segregation through policies to reduce socioeconomic inequality? And I think we should be skeptical. These kinds of policies, I think, have an important policy component and important to policy debates. However, they are not panaceas. And we know from policy evaluations across the country that if we really want to attack explicit racial inequalities in schools and housing, then we need explicit racial policies that really focus on undoing those racial inequalities. That is, we should be skeptical of non-racial policies will attack and undo racial inequality. All right. So the idea here is that class policies can reduce racial inequalities. I think we need to kind of problematize that. Third one here. Fair housing laws and anti-discrimination statutes. All right, so the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was a major milestone in the history of U.S. social policy. It's very important because it helped dismantle the institutional and legal foundations of explicit racial discrimination in housing. Okay, so basically, the federal government came forward and said it is illegal to practice overt and explicit racial discrimination in the buying and selling of real estate and housing. Okay, whereas before that time, there might have been local laws and local ordinances against explicit racial discrimination, but now the federal government was coming out and explicitly outlawing explicit racial discrimination in the buying and selling of real estate. And another major aspect of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 that occurred over the next several decades was the formation of fair housing ordinances in many cities, as well as the creation of a network, a very powerful network of housing groups, organizations, and agencies to combat racial discrimination in housing markets. Okay, so it's not surprising, both in Kansas City, but many cities in the United States, where we see our fair housing action centers that monitor the buying and selling of real estate and every so often conduct housing audit studies to see if racial discrimination is being practiced in the local housing market. Okay, so we know these housing audit studies. Basically, you send out what are called testers. You send out white couples, you send out African-American couples, you send out other couples, and you keep everything about them equal except their race. And you target different apartment complexes and real estate agencies. And basically, it's a natural experiment. How do we know if racial discrimination is being practiced in the local housing market? Well, the testers will go out, they'll see if they can then acquire housing. And they'll take notes, and they'll come back and compare the notes. Not surprisingly, the African American testers may not perceive any racial discrimination or prejudice in their search for housing until they compare their notes with the other testers. And they might have gone to apartment complex A, and the landlord said to the white couple, yes, we have housing, but told the African American couple, no, we do not have any housing. So everything is the same about these testers. They're testing the housing market. The income the same, the socioeconomic status is the same, the age is the same. Okay? The only thing that's different is the race. Okay, so that's how, and if there's a case of this, it's usually brought before the Fair Housing Organization, Fair Housing Action Center. It's called different things in different cities. And then eventually brought before the Justice Department, and then the Justice Department can make a decision whether to launch a lawsuit. Okay, so it's great. I love talking about this when I teach courses because some students come into the course thinking, oh, racial discrimination, that's something that happened in the past. That doesn't happen anymore. And I just, I say to them, well, how do you know that? Okay? What makes you so sure? And who informed you that racial discrimination does not occur? Well, we have a natural experiment where we can see how it occurs. Maybe it's occurring. Maybe it's not, but let's look at some of the research on it. So the Fair Housing Act in 1968 was a very powerful and very important policy development, a legislative tool, and a development of mechanisms to attack racial discrimination in housing. But I want to kind of back up here about it. Okay, now we've seen over time that racial anti-discrimination statutes and fair housing laws are actually kind of weak tools for undoing what we already have, patterns of segregation. And that's because fair housing laws are reactive, not proactive. Okay, so fair housing laws respond to the problem of segregation and discrimination in the housing market. They don't directly intervene in dismantling those foundations of discrimination in the housing markets. Okay, so fair housing laws respond to violations of the law rather than attacking the segregation through proactive measures. And fair housing laws do not challenge the institutional practices, ideology, and activities of the real estate industry that continue to reinforce segregation to this day. Okay, so my point here, I'm not criticizing fair housing laws. I'm just pointing out there's a nuance here that we need to be aware of. And they are not panaceas for undoing segregation. They are great tools, great education tools for showing people how racial discrimination is still a continuing feature of our housing markets. And it's a great tool for attacking instances of racial discrimination. Okay, redefine affordable housing. Affordable housing has over time acquired a major stigma in cities around the United States. That when people talk about affordable housing, they increasingly associate it with low-income housing. And it's the new stigma that public housing had decades ago. Okay, so I think we need to attack that stigma. We all need affordable housing. Okay, middle-income, working people need affordable housing. And in cities across the United States, we're seeing huge increases in housing, in inner-city housing markets. And this is something that's not just peculiar to Kansas City, but it is occurring in many cities in the United States. So affordable housing, I think we need to redefine that category as inclusive of community needs and not something that's restricted just to poor people. I think it's important to promote scattered site rehabilitation and preservation of affordable housing, not just in disadvantaged neighborhoods, but also in low poverty areas and also near high quality schools. Modify and expand housing voucher systems. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about a policy that's being implemented right now in Seattle, Washington. Okay? And basically, housing voucher systems are systems where a voucher is provided to people who qualify as low-income people to search for housing wherever they may find it. Okay, So the idea is, and it's a very politically conservative policy, actually originated during the 1970s through Republican Jack Kemp, who wanted to develop a housing voucher system to dismantle the public housing system. Instead of giving money to public housing authorities, we give money to poor people, and they search for housing wherever they may find it in cities. Not surprisingly, studies of housing voucher systems have found that the program tends to reinforce and perpetuate both racial and class segregation. And one of the ways that we can help, hopefully, maybe eliminate or at least reduce the tendency for housing voucher systems to perpetuate and reinforce segregation is not eliminating the voucher, but when people get the voucher, educate them on the demographic, the socioeconomic character of the entire metropolitan area. Let them know, show them census data, show them housing reports, show them areas of the metropolitan area where you have high-quality schools, where you have affordable housing in high-quality neighborhoods. So we want to modify the policy to discourage voucher use only in lower poverty neighborhoods. We also want to remove the jurisdictional barrier. Okay, so instead of low-income families and low-income people being restricted to Kansas City, Missouri, or Kansas City, Kansas, that they can use the voucher in Johnson County or north of the river to look for housing. Okay, so we don't just provide them the housing and say, hasta la vista, go look for housing where you can find it. You educate them on the quality of housing and quality of schools in the metropolitan area. Okay, so it's providing information to voucher recipients on neighborhoods that offer opportunities for upward mobility. Okay, so there's an experiment going on in Seattle right now, controlling for those residents who just received the voucher and those residents that received the voucher and education about the housing market. And they're finding that those residents that received the voucher plus the education are not relocating back into high poverty neighborhoods. All right, so that's one policy. Okay, and again, like the others, it's not a panacea. There are consequences and limitations to it, but it's also an important policy to consider. All right, so lastly, metropolitan-wide policies. All right, I think this is I think the most ambitious, but also the most difficult to implement. And there are several I want to focus on here. Establish metropolitan-wide planning commissions with strong legal powers to control development. All right, so this is not something that the Chamber of Commerce is going to support. It's not something that the Mid-American Regional Council will support here in Kansas City. However, I think it is important for us to debate and discuss both the limitations and the advantages of having a metropolitan-wide council that hypothetically could have legal powers to control development. What if we had metropolitan-wide school districts? Okay, so we know when we look at cities or metropolitan areas around the United States, it's a plethora of jurisdictions. We have utility boards, we have police departments, we have city governments, we have hundreds of governments within each metropolitan area. Okay, so we know Kansas City is way out there. We have a major state line that bisects the metropolitan area. Okay, and this metropolitan fragmentation was a major impediment to a comprehensive metropolitan-wide desegregation measures that were being proposed during the 1970s and 1980s. In addition to school districts, what about metropolitan-wide housing authorities? Okay, so housing authorities are restricted to cities. What if we had a metropolitan-wide housing authority instead of just a whole plethora of individual housing authorities? Okay, suburban exclusionary zoning. If we could eliminate local zoning rules that make affordable housing impossible, for example, rules that specify minimum lot size. And it's not surprising. We see this a lot in cities and in areas of Johnson County, across the state line. Huge lots being zoned to only build big, large homes. And that's actually an impediment to racial and class equity across the metropolitan area. Adopt inclusionary zoning requirements to development incentives. So if we want to incentivize developers to build housing in different parts of the metropolitan area, adopt inclusionary zoning requirements that developers cannot necessarily just build housing for the wealthy and affluent, but also that if they want tax subsidies to build housing, they should set aside a certain number for lower income residents. And that's happening, but it's not necessarily happening on a widespread scale. And I'd say, lastly, what if we adopted tax incentives for homeowners to live in racially and class mixed neighborhoods? Okay, so an incentive for people to look for housing in a class mixed, in a racially mixed neighborhood. Okay, what might that do? Okay, so all these aspects here, I mentioned a whole bunch of them underneath the last bullet point, are just policies that we could that by themselves would not address the tenacious and persistent racial divides and class divide that we have in our metropolitan areas. But I think would be important to debate and discuss, especially since much of what I discussed on this last slide are not necessarily policies and practices that the City Council, government actors, or even chambers of commerce are likely to take up. Okay, so thank you.